Good evening and welcome to Legal Tech Live, episode 78. I'm here with the two Jasons tonight. Jason Morris from Blawx, who will be interviewing and co-hosting tonight out of sunny Southern California, is Jason Velez of One Law. Thank you both for being here. A little background about our guest and our guest co-host tonight, Jason Morris, not the Olympic judo champion. Jason is a husband, father of three, and lawyer in the province of Alberta. Law is his second career, and after a successful stint as a software developer and database analyst, he started Roundtable Law in 2011. He is currently an LLM student at the University of Alberta studying computational law, jointly between the Faculty of Law and the Department of Computer Science. He was named an ABA Center for Innovation Fellow for the 2018-2019 year. He has been invited to speak on law and technology by the University of Alberta, Clio Cloud Conference, and TEDxU Alberta, among others. And you can find his TEDx talk on YouTube. Jason and I have been talking pretty regularly. And our co-host tonight, Jason Velez, also not a professional boxer, Jason Velez. He is are you the CEO of One Law?
Yeah, CEO, founder.
CEO and founder of One Law. And we need to work on your bio on LinkedIn, but you are...
Okay. Let's see, father of two, husband of one, and a little dog, and just...
hero to many.
Yeah, I'm just an enthusiast, lawyer turned, tech guy.
Excellent. Oh, I do see something here. Capitalist with a conscience. I like that. Developed a platform which provides on-demand legal access and document automation via AI DocuBot, striving to make quality legal representation available to all through profitability of personal injury law. Okay, I missed that. That was my fault. Looks good. So thank you both for being here. Jason Morris, a little background. Give us a little background on Blawx. We've got it, the drag and drop solution for what?
Right. So about coming up 4 years ago, I went to a conference in St. Louis called TBD that the people at Lawyerist put on. And while I was there, I had a conversation with some of the attendees about this idea that I had that programmers had a lot of help when they were writing code, but lawyers didn't have any help from software when they were writing contracts or writing legislation. And it seemed to me like there were a lot of parallels there. Why isn't there a programming language for law? And David Colarusso, who's now at LitLab in Suffolk, he said, actually, I've heard of something like that. And he put me in touch with a guy who had been at Codex Stanford. And I kind of discovered this world of programming languages that are built for doing declarative logic reasoning. And I kind of fell down the rabbit hole. Fast forward about a year, I'm applying for a degree at the university because I've already decided I'm going to learn this stuff. I might as well see if someone's going to be willing to give me a piece of paper to prove that I learned it. University, much to my surprise, says, yeah, sure. That sounds like a master's degree to us. And so about the last 3 years, I've been kind of learning 2 or 3 different programming languages and doing surveys for tools that are out there. And I've been kind of aware of what I would like to have for my own purposes, because I've been doing some automation with DocAssemble and things like that. And none of the tools that were out there quite fit the bill. And so, yeah, I kind of had this list of things in my head that I wanted a tool to be able to do. Foremost among them were 2 things. One, I wanted it to be open source. And 2, I wanted it to be approachable, easy for lawyers to learn how to use.
Okay.
And there were some open source tools out there, but none that were easy to use. They were all just kind of, open up your Unix terminal and start programming type things. So are you familiar with Scratch? It's like
I've just learned about Scratch in like the last week or two. Jason B, are you familiar with Scratch?
No, I mean, not off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So Scratch is this thing that was originally built at MIT as a tool for teaching kids how to do coding.
Okay.
And basically the idea is you take all of the syntactical elements of a programming language, like functions and brackets and all of the symbols and everything, and you turn them into puzzle pieces. And you code it in such a way that you drag and drop the puzzle pieces, but they won't snap unless you're putting the right thing in. So typos become a lot harder to do because you can type anything and the computer may underline it for you eventually or give you an error when you're compiling or what have you, but you don't know you're making a mistake as you're making the mistake. With Scratch, the idea is the kid can't make a whole bunch of types of mistakes because of the way the visual interface is defined. The puzzle pieces just won't go together. So there's an open source kind of platform for building your own visual programming environments that's released by Google. It's called Blawx.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically took Blawx and I reconfigured it and built some new interface elements and kind of did some code development stuff to create a front end for an open source declarative logic programming language called Flora 2. Okay. Flora 2, in my mind, not realistic to expect the average law student to pick that up and learn it in the course of a 4-month course or something and really be able to employ it. But combine Flora 2 with Blawx and you get something that is approachable, and it's, when you're looking at it, it's intuitive to look at. When you're using it, it teaches you by preventing you from making different kinds of mistakes. And the language is actually pretty powerful. So that's what Blawx is. It's a combination of an open source programming language for declarative logic reasoning with a open source visual development environment. And the idea is to create something that is easy for people to learn how to use, or at the very least, easier than programming languages are.
Sure.
And that gives you all of the advantages that come from declarative logic programming, which is really, really useful in law.
Excellent.
Nice.
Velez, jump in.
No, I was just kind of, piecing it together. So what are some of the things you've built with it? What are some of the deployments you have?
So it's a alpha, minimum viable prototype at this point. Most of the things that I've built with it have been kind of demonstrations. I've done things like encoded the rules to rock, paper, scissors and showed how you can generate test cases and figure out who won the game. There's this movement out there in public sectors around the world called rules as code. And this is a really interesting idea and a place where something like Blawx might be really useful. That what would make things better from the perspective of people who are trying to accomplish policy objectives inside governments is if the rules were easier to implement as automated services, if the laws weren't so darn complicated to try and code. And what they've learned over the course of some experiments is that if you have a programmer in the room while you are drafting the law, two things happen. One, you end up with a law that is way easier to implement later as an automated system. But two, even if you never automate it later, you end up with objectively better laws. There's fewer loopholes and more edge cases are caught, and there's less redundancies and things like that. Everything's clearer because you forced it into that discipline of being able to code it. So some rules as code people came up with a pretend example law called the Australian Beard Tax Act of 1934 or something like that. Which I guess is how New Zealanders make fun of Australians, is that they're tax beards. I don't really know. But the idea is they created this fake act so that people who are using a bunch of different technologies for rules as code could all try those technologies against this one act and use it as a kind of a test base to kind of see how it works. So there's a GitHub repository that's got the law in there, and then you can go into the GitHub repository and encode that law in a bunch of different tools and a bunch of different languages and kind of release that to everyone and let them see how it works. So one of the things that I did is an encoding of the Australian Beard Tax Act. That's probably the most complicated thing that I did. And then I built a connector for DocAssemble so that DocAssemble can make requests of the Blawx.com server. So you can now take your Blawx code, save it to a file, upload it onto your DocAssemble server, and then send a request to Blawx.com with the data from your DocAssemble interview. Blawx.com will crunch the data, answer your question, and send it back to DocAssemble, and then DocAssemble can display it on the screen. So I've done that demo for a couple of different conferences, a legal hackers conference in London, and something in Ottawa for the community of federal regulators. They had this great thing on rules as code there. So that's kind of the most complicated thing that I've done with it so far, apart from just toy examples.
All right.
Yeah.
And we've got Jim Hacking joining us over in Facebook. Welcome, Jim. And we've got Adam Kerpelman and Blaine Corty here in the Zoom room. So anybody with questions, please feel free to ask them, and we'll try and get them answered online.
Well, I got a question. One thing I like that you mentioned, and what's cool is being in the alpha stage is what I found useful on a little bit the other end of the arc, but is iterating, because half of the battle is really presenting the idea, right? And that's the beauty of anything that is, you know, automated or just somewhat sexy. If you can deploy it fairly quickly, it makes the idea that much more tangible. And so
that's exactly right. I mean,
that is a good point, Jason.
Like, even among programmers, like, declarative logic programming is not something that a lot of coders know. You might have heard about Prolog, but there's no guarantee that in the course of a university degree you would have touched it. And so I can't just go out there and say, hey, everybody, what if we use declarative logic programming in law? Wouldn't that be great? And expect anyone to have any idea what I'm talking about. I need to show people, right? I can't just say this is an easier way to encode laws because it's less complicated when the law changes. I need to show that to people, right? And so that was part of the motivation, is that Blawx was basically, I need a prototype so that I can show people what I'm talking about, because if I describe it to them, it won't mean anything.
Yeah, and I was actually going to have you describe a little bit more on the declarative logic for our listeners.
Yeah.
But let's stray away from that for a moment. What would the use, the rules as code kind of use? And I came across something that I'll share with you after the show tonight to see if that was right. Feels that it's very similar. That sounds to me like there are compliance related uses for what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
And I came across somebody else who's doing something similar with the rules as code for compliance that I'll share with you later. But is this a reg tech play as much as it is a legal tech play? Regulations and compliance tech? Yeah,
and there's a couple of reasons that it's really well suited to the regulatory compliance space. One is that from the startup perspective, that's where people are spending a lot of money right now trying to deal with very similar problems, right? Like I read that the amount of money that is spent in Australia by banks trying to comply with their financial regulations is in the range of like 140 billion Australian dollars a year. And so there's a lot of effort that's going in there. Banking associations in Australia and in the UK have said, look, the regulations there's so many of them, and they are changing so fast that it's becoming extremely difficult for us to keep pace and have any hope of complying. So they have been calling on governments to change the way that they do regulation and in a more automated fashion. So that's definitely a place where there's people in the private sector that are pushing governments in the direction of rules as code. But another reason that it's really useful is what actually happens inside an organization like a bank is they go from what the regulations are and what the laws are and their internal rules that they want to follow. And then they generate a set of policies that are designed to comply with all those things. It's way easier to encode policies than it is to encode laws. And the reason is, if the policy doesn't quite fit the metaphor that your coding tool uses, it's your policy, just change it, right?
Mhm.
You don't have that option with laws. You have to kind of get as close as you can to what the legislators said or the regulators wrote. But when it's your own internal policy, you've got a lot of flexibility there. So these
Right.
tools are even more useful there, because if the tool can't reflect the policy perfectly, you can just change the policy a little bit.
Right, you could tweak.
And now you've got something you can totally automate.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So in GDPR, I feel like would be one of those things that was a compliance nightmare for so many large marketing organizations or
Yeah.
marketing technology. So something like this might be applicable in a similar sense.
Yeah, privacy is another place where it's you have the advantage that virtually everyone is required to comply with that same rule. Another place that I've seen similar tools built but with different technology is what is it called? The sanctions. So people that you're prohibited from doing business with because they've been sanctioned by your government.
The foreign corrupt practices and that type of a thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's centralized databases of who is on the blacklist, and then you can have an automated system that'll just double check that all of your potential transactions are with people you're allowed to do business with.
Interesting. Velez, what's happening? Got any thoughts here?
Well, I was just on the regulatory side. One of the things, I mean, it's a great space, one, but just that need to update, right? Your compliance, once you tag a regulation and then to have it, if there's a change, it's that much easier through a system like yours to be able to identify and arguably supplant, right? You're just going to just put the change right into the environment.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it's
that's
like,
one of the big advantages with rules as code is, and I mean, Jason, you'll definitely know this, when you are building apps in the typical way that we can right now, there's 3 different kinds of logic that end up put into the code, right? One of them is the legal logic, right? Like if you're over the age of 18, then you're authorized to write a will or what have you.
Right.
Another one is the application logic, which is this is a tool for writing a will, so I need to ask certain kinds of questions. Or this is a tool for finding out whether or not I am authorized to write a will. And so I need to ask different kinds of questions.
Right.
And then there's the interface logic, which is what question do you want to ask and in what order, and when do you want the question to appear and when do you not want it to appear. So in the typical tool for building these sorts of things like DocAssemble, you would very often find those 3 kinds of logic kind of intermingled. It's the same show if statement that's being used to implement all 3 potential reasons for showing or not showing a question. So one of the big advantages of rules as code is you can take the legal logic and you can put that in a separate file and just refer to it at various points in the interview when you need to. And then if the rules change, you just change that one file, and all of the applications that are using that same encoding of the law are now up to date.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons that it's kind of an exciting prospect inside public administration departments, is because they look at this as an opportunity to basically go from a new rule, a new regulation, a new law, to an application that helps people comply with that law, more or less with 0 friction.
Yeah.
That would be very inviting for regulators and legislators.
Exactly. Yeah. So from their perspective, they're looking at, okay, we've got a complicated tax code and then we've got TurboTax, right? But TurboTax had to spend a lot of time going through that process of encoding it and turning it into something that's, automatable. So what if, while we were drafting the law, we were going through that process ourselves, and when we had released the income tax, building TurboTax would have been trivially simple, right? And what if we did that for all kinds of different laws? What if we did it for privacy regulations? What if we did it for corporate registration or securities or what have you? So it's an exciting idea. It's relatively far down the road, because the tools that you would need in order to get legislative drafters to buy into using this kind of technology, and that's one of the groups that you would need to have as users.
Right.
Those tools, frankly, just don't exist yet. And one of the reasons that they don't exist is because the really great stuff that's out there is proprietary, and the public sector is not interested in having the proprietary encoding of the law be determinative of people's rights, right? They want something that people can download and use themselves and double check the logic of and complain about if it's wrong. So open source is a really important factor. And then what's open source is missing some features. It doesn't have explainability. It's not very easy to use. All of these things are like solved technical problems. It's not like anyone's going to have to invent anything new in order to get where we need to go. It's just someone's going to need to have some money and some time.
It's the conundrum, right? Because it's generally the engine that's open source, right? And now you have to put, like you said, you built a front end. That's the dilemma, right? Is who's building to it? Our engines, it's free, but who's going to build to it, right? And that's always the But no, that's great. That's actually great insight, though. From I never looked at the dilemma facing the public. That hey, we don't you can't always have a private solution come in. You could hire private, but it would have to be owned publicly. So it's kind of an interesting, but the nice thing, Canada, you might be well situated to attack something like that because there's a lot more cooperation between some of your universities. And I could see getting a little cohort on there that might,
Yeah, I like for my part, in a perfect world, someone would come along and give me $1 million. And I'd head over to the University of Alberta and say, look, we're starting a Rules as Code Institute. And we're going to do research. We're going to figure out what's easy to learn. We're going to figure out what's important from the drafters' perspectives. And we are just going to, we're going to find some users and we're going to build and we're going to test and we're going to build and we're test. Yeah. And we're going to write reports and help people know what's important here and release open source software for this. That's, that would be a great way to spend the second half of my life, as far as I'm concerned. I think that'd be a really, really valuable thing. But we're not quite there yet. Where we are in Canada is the government of Canada has been doing a Rules as Code discovery project. And they are kind of repeating inside the Canadian context some experiments that have been done in Australia and New Zealand. I think similar stuff has been done in the UK. I know that there's some work that's been done in France in terms of encoding benefits legislation there to see what kinds of public benefits you're entitled to. But there's actually an interesting point here, and I don't this is a theory that I have, and you guys can let me know whether or not it makes sense to you. But the theory that I have is that this might work better in Commonwealth countries that use the Westminster parliamentarian system, as opposed to the Republican system that you guys have in the US, because I feel like in Canada and other Westminster parliaments, there's less horse trading that goes into how legislation is drafted. And that's because the executive is the majority in the legislature in Westminster parliaments. So whatever the government brings forward is more or less what's going to get passed. You don't have a lot of horse trading for getting this local project funded or what have you that goes into the legislation. And as a result, you have a lot less drafting being done by politicians in Canada than you would have in the US.
I have a thought on this that, and I want to thank Aaron Levine for being here. And
hey, Aaron.
And Jason, just so you know, I mentioned, and thank you to Morris Lilienthal, who's also watching. I said, hi, Aaron Levine in the Facebook group, to which she replied, hi, Jason Velez, which is about right for our friendship. Yeah. and Mitch Jackson has also joined. So thank you for being here, Mitch.
Hey, Mitch.
A thought on that. Interestingly, I did a internship in Sacramento in the lobbyists and those types of, in the U.S., do significant portions of the writing of legislation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. In the U.S.,
so that's a different version of the same thing.
That could be a target market, and they generally have lots of money.
This is the thing, right? Like, if what you're interested in finding out is, hey, if we were to change this one section of this one act in this particular way, how does that impact my organization's costs over the course of an average year or something like that. That kind of analysis, that kind of what if analysis for amendments to legislation is something that you can do with rules as code. In fact, I mean, maybe you can see behind me here, I've got the whole selection of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons books. One of the things that I would love to do is if I could encode some of the rules to Dungeons and Dragons and then use it to build a what if analysis to figure out, like, what if the party is at a different level, or what if a different monster shows up? How does that change? Or what if this change to the rules happens? How does that change how dangerous this particular encounter would be, right? That's a thing that you can do if the rules are encoded. You can do automated tests, and you can randomly generate millions of fact scenarios, have them all run through the system, and then search those results for weird things that you did not want to have happen, right? So there's all kinds of neat kinds of analytics that you can do against potential amendments using this technology, at least in theory. I've never seen anyone actually do it yet.
And Daza Greenwood's joining us and says he wants to help encode D&D rules.
Great. Well, there's at least 2 of us now, Daza, so we'll get started.
Oh boy, indeed. I was just going to comment that the one place in the U.S. law that would be very akin, based on what you said, is the regulatory state, right? Because in the regulatory body, the executive kind of is. It is going to go the way the executive wants to go. I mean, there's the comment phase, so that there is that parallel. Yeah. But also, when you started out earlier this evening and said about the kind of being able to rules and code, and I thought, well, wait a minute, what about all the fluff, right? And that's the add-ons and all of that stuff that really don't have anything to do with the substance of the law. But you have a tax law that involves whatever aircraft carriers. It's totally unrelated. But I think there's administrative application as well.
And so one of the tools that's out there that is I'd say probably top of the heap. Part of my LLM research has been actually trying to find things that use this technology and figure out where they're being used. And I think the best one that's out there right now is actually a tool that's offered by Oracle called Oracle Intelligent Advisor. It was recently renamed from Oracle Policy Automation. And this is a tool that, if I'm not mistaken, it's used by the U.S. government in implementing the Obamacare program. So the online eligibility tools, where you can go onto the website and figure out what programs or what policies you qualify for or what have you. My understanding is that that was built in Oracle Policy Automation, which is a declarative logic programming tool for encoding policy or legislation or rules or what have you. So it's not unheard of for this technology to get used. What's problematic about Oracle Policy Automation is that it's proprietary. It's relatively expensive, so a government could realistically use it, but the average, access to justice pro bono legal clinic would never be able to afford it. Right. And it's missing a couple of useful features that some other tools have that would be nice to have. But that's one of the good ones that's out there. It's used in the UK for eligibility for legal aid. It's used in a bunch of insurance companies and banks to kind of help with customer service processes. So the tool does exist. LegalTechLIVE is another one that's out there that's in this category, targeted at legal. Although in the course of the last year, they've decided to expand their scope to include non-legal applications, and they've put people from insurance companies on the board. So LegalTechLIVE is another tool, again, proprietary, relatively expensive for the pro bono space, so it doesn't have the benefits of open source in that respect. And for my for my user experience, there's features that are really important that I feel like Neota just can't give me. So I've always moved towards other directions, but it's not like there are commercial offerings in this space. It's just nothing that I feel like has had the reach or success that it deserves, which is ironic because Oracle Policy Automation, if you kind of follow the history of that product back, that was written by lawyers for lawyers in Australia in like the 80s.
Yeah.
And then it turned into another product that turned into another product that turned into another product. Now it's owned by Oracle, and it's sold through consulting companies primarily. And I've spoken with people who work in these consulting companies, and they said they've completely given up trying to sell it for legal applications because they would need to convince people to change away from billable hours. And that's the only way to make it the efficiency gains worth anything.
Yeah.
And it's just too big an ask. So they focus on large institutions and government departments instead.
Okay. I want to change. We've got a question from Blaine Corty here from Fidu Legal, who was on episode 76 with us, from Fidu. Blaine asks, Jason, I see Blawx is open source on GitHub. Do you have commercialization plans? And because this is a startup show,
yeah,
let's talk some commercialization plans.
Absolutely. So in order to be useful in the rules as code space in public applications, it needs to be an open source tool. In terms of commercialization plans, I'm currently working. So I've been invited to join a program at Ryerson's Legal Innovation Zone that's kind of a virtual 6-week startup incubator type thing. And the pitch that I'm working on is essentially trying to figure out how you can use Blawx in order to build regulation tools that would be useful inside investment firms for doing compliance with individual trades, which is something that, you know, human beings are employed to do right now to check whether this trade is you know, within the lines according to a bunch of different requirements. So yeah, that's the commercial play right now, is the thing that I might be able to build with it. The thing itself, potentially you could turn it into something that was like a software as a service type environment where people could log in and do their encodings there and then publish their encodings as an API, which then could be used by any other tool that you decided to give access. But I mean, that's kind of further down the road. I think it would be more effective to try and show what you can do with it before you try and convince anyone to spend money to try and do the same thing.
Okay. Jason, Shark Tank him.
Shark Tank him. Yeah, I like what I'm hearing. Just, you know, have you thought about any, I was just thinking municipalities, you know, kind of the lowest of the government entities that may give you some test beds.
Yes. So I mean, I've looked at that. If I'm not mistaken, there was a company that you had on the show recently, Nick, that out of California, and the name escapes me right now, but they were doing some stuff on planning regulations in municipalities. Symbium, thank you. So I don't know, but I imagine that Symbium is using a similar kind of technology here, because I know that some of the people involved in it have done research in this space. And that's what they're doing, and it kind of makes a lot of sense from that perspective. My feeling on the matter is, I don't want to throw myself into the sales timelines that are involved in selling to governments.
It may be worse than selling to lawyers.
Yeah, it takes forever to do anything with the government. And then so I mean, Shark Tank is the American version of what was originally a Canadian show, I don't mind saying, called Dragon's Den. And one of the guys who was on Dragon's Den had this thing about anything that's sold to governments. He said if the government doesn't like the contract, they're just going to legislate their way out of it. So he was always against it. But yeah, I think that's a kind of a concern. Also, I feel like while governments have a certain amount of pressure towards efficiency, I think the push towards efficiency in financial institutions is probably stronger. And it's not governments who are making press releases and doing reports and going into senates around the world saying, hey, we need to do something about how complicated these rules are. It's banks, it's investment companies. That's where the pain point is. So I'm more interested in helping the people who feel the problem most specifically.
So they're going to have a long run up as well. So what's the plan? How are you gonna fill the gap, or how do you what's your dance going to be?
So I'm currently working with, I'm trying to build up contacts. Hey, if anyone knows anyone who works in an investment firm, particularly anyone who works in compliance for an investment firm, I would love to chat with them. I'm still doing user research, trying to understand better. But the current plan is, people I'm talking to, I'm trying to understand what specific types of things they're doing. I'm trying to understand how human beings are being used to do these things, and trying to figure out how I can use Blawx to build tools that automate those processes and learn whether or not they're faster doing it that way. So the idea is start small. So for example, one of the things that a compliance officer has to decide. So you're a trader, you're a portfolio manager, you want to buy whatever it is, you put it into your Bloomberg terminal or whatever, and then it gets sent to the compliance officer. And the compliance officer looks at it and they see the flags that the Bloomberg is capable of calculating. And then they've got a list of checks that they're going to go through. Does this comply with the investment contract that we have with the client? Does this comply with the rules that we have about what this portfolio manager is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do? Does it comply with our current list of firms about whom we have insider information, and so we're not allowed to trade with them today? Various things like that. So my plan is find one of those things and encode it and build a tool that uses the information out of Bloomberg and the information out of other sources and automatically answers that question as soon as the thing shows up on the screen. Then step 2, show the compliance officer how they can change the code. They can go into Blawx, which is readable and approachable, and they can actually change the encoding themselves, and they can build their own rules inside Blawx and have the tool be updated to deal with the changes whenever the rules change, right? Then you've demonstrated the main benefit of the system in a relatively small space. But you've proved that it's capable of doing those particular things. Once you've proved it's capable of doing those particular things, now you go to, okay, what do you spend most of your time trying to figure out? And maybe it's whether or not this particular trade is compliant according to our investment contract, right? So then you start to look at, okay, how complicated would it be to build a version of this that allows compliance officers to encode the requirements of investment contracts? And then you have a tool that can automatically take data out of Bloomberg. It can take your Blawx encoding of the investment contract, and it can answer the questions that the compliance officer would need to think really hard about, more or less instantaneously, at least for some percentage of the transactions, right? Then you're talking about something that's potentially a cost savings in terms of staff for the investment company.
So it is, I'm thinking pitch terms, this is a productivity tool for compliance.
Yeah, essentially it's taking, the idea is you're spending a lot of money to pay a lot of highly intelligent and professional people to go through what is effectively a deterministic math problem in order to decide whether or not to do this transaction. And we can take that away from them. We can use them on more useful things, and you can have fewer of them and deal with the same number of transactions and potentially increase your compliance because the computer isn't going to make mistakes when they get tired.
Yeah. Chase Hurdle is here, and he says, love hearing how much this has developed since we last talked, Jason Morris.
Yeah.
Oh. Jason Velez.
So,
got some questions?
Yeah, here's one thought I had. I mean, so is there, I just kind of, now I'm thinking as a potential user, how can I, in a, small, medium business, is there something, I mean, I'm just trying to think, is it process driven? I want to get my staff from A to Z, and I don't want to have to babysit them, or I want to put it in one time. I mean, any thoughts on that, smaller deployment?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's kind of difficult is to draw this distinction between rules compliance and workflow, right? Virtually everything that's out there is a workflow tool in some way or another. It's going through a series of processes that it may branch, but you're kind of going from point A to point Z according to one of these possible routes. And that's not what Blawx is for. What Blawx is for is to eliminate the need to build that flowchart when all you're trying to do is comply with rules that you already know. So what Blawx does is it allows you to just say what the rules are, and then Blawx figures out the process for determining the answer to any particular question, so you don't have to code it.
Gotcha.
So what it really is it's a more efficient way of building automated systems when your automated system is trying to comply with rules that were written by a human being, because it allows you to encode those rules in a way that's more consistent with how they were written in the first place, and makes it way easier to update them when the rules change. So it's kind of a back-end solution, if that makes sense. So you have to kind of already be looking at building automated solutions to things before Blawx is going to seem particularly useful. And the more complicated the rule set you're trying to deal with, the bigger and the more frequently it changes, the bigger an advantage you're going to get from using something like Blawx.
Yeah. No, I like. I mean, it's heavy stuff. You know, this is next gen, right? This is, I'm sure if Daz is still around here, you know, this is the computational law type of stuff.
Yeah, that's what it is. And Daz and I have talked about this. I'm working on an article actually for version 2 of the computational law journal at MIT. That Daza runs. It'll be talking about Blawx. So
that is the Daza is still here, and that's the computational law report. I'll get that correct for him because they were a former guest, and he wants to go ahead and step this up a bit for us. For those who are interested in computational law, Daza is going to go ahead and make it a little more complex this interview. What are examples? His question to you, Jason Morris. What are examples of compliance type systems that Blawx composed deterministic rules connect with? Thanks, Daza.
Yeah, I mean, so let me make. Oh, hey!
Yay, we got the child.
This
child has made it. Who is this?
This is Oliver, everybody.
Oliver.
Oliver.
You want to wave? Oliver just came back from his drum lesson.
Nice.
And for replay viewers and audio listeners only, we have Oliver Morris in the house.
Yeah. So,
do you need me to repeat?
Yeah, repeat Daz's question for me there.
Okay. What are examples of compliance type systems the Blawx composed deterministic rules connect with?
I mean,
and you can ignore him. I mean,
he's
not really here.
I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not sure if Daza may be having more cocktails than I am. I don't understand the question. But what I'll say is, there's two things that it connects to, right? Two things that it needs to connect to. On the one side of Blawx, you've got whatever your rule set is, right? And then you got Blawx, and then on the other side, you've got whatever your tool is, your interface that's going out to the user and that's going to take advantage of the answers that Blawx can provide. So what kinds of tools are over here? Things like DocAssemble, things like any kind of website, basically anything that has an ability to send an API request, you can use Blawx with that. It's already got an API in the alpha version right now. So anything that can send an API request and display the results is capable of using the answers that you get out of Blawx. What is a good kind of problem to stick into an encoded rule? It's going to be something that is a relatively complicated set of rules. You don't necessarily know in advance what question you're going to want to answer. For instance, you don't know if the answer is my will valid? Or the question is, am I authorized to write one in the first place? The rules are mostly determinative, or they can be determined on the basis of information that is likely to be in the hands of the person who will be using the software. So if it depends on what some third party thinks about the reasonableness of something, that's not a good option. And B, it's going to be based on facts that are unlikely to be in dispute between people.
Hence the regulatory compliance.
Right. I mean, this is what I sold. This is what I bought. This is how much I paid for it. This is who it went to. These things are not really disputed. Figuring out whether or not it's compliant is a legal conclusion that you can get. It's relatively deterministic. It's based on facts that no one's really going to argue about. And all of the facts are in the hands of the person who's trying to be compliant at the time that they're trying to comply. So that's a really good space. That's the large description of the category. Anything that you can fit into that category, tax, privacy, like even the whether or not you're complying with the witnessing and signing requirements for a will.
And I'm thinking that there's, I think a lot of this, the anti-money laundering laws are pretty cut and dry on this type of thing and compliance with those.
Yeah. So one example, I did a thing as a part of my LLM. I did an experiment to see if I could encode the Adult Interdependent Partnership Act here in Alberta, which is Alberta's kind of like codification of common law marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a relatively recent act, which means it's got a very modern drafting strategy approach. And in that entire act, there was one subjective question that was relevant to anything that you'd be interested in figuring out. And that was whether the parties are in a relationship of interdependence.
Interesting.
So that if you can figure out what the likely answer is to that one question, the rest of the act was determinative and would be decided on the basis of when was this document signed, when did they move in together, did they separate, were they trying to reconcile, which are things that the people themselves would know at the time that they're trying to figure out whether they are a common law couple or not. So it's surprising really how much can be automated. There are still things you can't do, right? There's still things you can't get past. There's really, really fuzzy things. There's no case law. There's no real way to figure out what a judge would decide in advance. And it's just not, it's not ethical to kind of, you know, give a guess. And it would be unsatisfying to say the answer could be A or B. I don't know. But there's just like, even though that's true, there's so much stuff that we could do in the remainder. The stuff that is automatable is a really, really big category.
Yeah, that is, I think many of us, certainly in legal technology, agree with this. Getting rules and regulations to catch up with that. And even Jason, you being a practitioner probably can say even getting lawyers on board with that, it can be difficult.
Sure. But one thing I love, like this is, I think this is what drives all of legal tech. And this is the Don Quixote in all of us. That is, it's a necessary evolution. It makes sense, right? We can talk about, yes, it should, you know, we should be capable of doing this, but it's not built yet. And my wheel's just turning just, you know, because I'm a, you know, we call it a strict constructionist, right? And there's no way you can possibly legislate every contingency. And so what happens is you have this law that exists only till the point that the worst case scenario for it to be applied arises. And it's like, well, we didn't mean to kick grandma out of her house, but the law says if you were living in the house on a Monday, blah, blah, you know, that type of thing. And so this, I mean, I applaud you because this is a big step. This and the discussion you're opening up, and you know, this is big movement, and I'm blown away.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the big picture thing. Okay, the big picture thing
because for those of you who haven't been watching, we haven't covered anything big picture yet.
This is so
none of that happened. So now he's going to go to the big picture.
None of this has been interesting. Here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is we have digitized virtually everything out there, right? Like we've digitized still photos and turn them into something that you can manipulate inside a graphics program. We've digitized video and turned it into something that you can manipulate to the point now where you can do deep fakes. We've digitized just a wide realm of things that human beings produce. We have digitized documents, but lawyers don't deal with documents. We deal with rules. And until now, we haven't gotten to the stage where we can really say that rules have been digitized. We have not yet gotten to the point where rules are a thing that a computer can use, that a computer can manipulate or play with or do analysis against or what have you. And in all honesty, the technology for doing this has existed for 40 years, and we just haven't. And I think the reason we haven't is just because no one has bothered to make it easy enough. So the example, the analogy that I always draw is, you imagine an accountant in the 1970s, right? An accountant in the 1970s could have used a computer to do math in order to do their job better and more efficiently. But accountants in the 1970s didn't, because the only alternative they had was to learn a programming language. And learning a programming language was a really, really high threshold to get over, and you didn't know in advance how successful you were going to be or what the result was going to be. Then VisiCalc comes out and electronic spreadsheets are a thing, right? Now, getting a computer to do math has been made accessible in an interface that accountants are already familiar with. They're already using spreadsheets. They're just doing it on paper with pencil. Fast forward 25 years or so, and the ability to proficiently use electronic spreadsheets is a basic requirement of being an accountant. If you can't do that, you are no longer considered qualified to do your job. This is an absolute necessity, and it is taught to children starting at grade 3 or 4, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. Spreadsheets are ubiquitous, right? Spreadsheets are a programming environment, a declarative programming environment for math. That's what Excel is. It's a programming environment for math. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as an app that helps us do stuff with numbers, but it's both. And if you didn't have Excel, your only alternative was coding. So what I want Blawx or something else like Blawx to be is the Excel, the spreadsheets, the electronic spreadsheets for legal reasoning. The thing that allows us to digitize rules the way that accountants have been able to digitize math for decades. And what happened to accountants when they did this is demand for their services went up, their accuracy went up, their speed went up, the variety of services that they could offer went up, and it revolutionized the practice of accountancy. And I can't think of a reason that we shouldn't think the exact same thing would happen to the profession of law. If we had something that was as easy to use for digitizing legal reasoning, as easy to integrate with other tools as we know it's possible to make it, there's every reason to believe that it will create completely new realms of legal service. There will be people who will be doing legislative amendment analysis electronically for lobbying companies. There were people who will be doing electronic drafting of legislation for governments. There will be people doing all kinds of things that do not exist now, only because as of now, to do those things, the amount of time that it would take to do the mental math is prohibitive. Accountants didn't used to do what if analysis in the 70s because it would have taken too long to run through all the numbers 3 times. And now that's all accountants do, is offer you options and tell you what the likely outcomes is. So
and Adam Long notes, Adam Long notes, and note that there is still plenty of judgment in accounting, and in that spreadsheets in Excel did not eliminate accountants.
No, quite the opposite. The profession grew because it became capable of doing more, better, faster. Well,
I really appreciate this. I could keep going with this. I want to thank Carolyn Elephant for being here.
Hey, Carolyn,
Adam Long is here. Did you hear that, Carolyn? You got a big fan here. Ashley Pepitone joined. We've had a very active group tonight in the Facebook group, and quiet but consistent group here in Zoom. Thank you. We've got Matt Carey here and Blaine Corty are here. So I wish we could go on forever. We cannot.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is I'm sure there will be time for you to come back. What is something you would want to say to wrap up the evening? What would you like people, listeners, who got fairly engaged folks over in these and replay viewers and all that, what would you want them to know about Blawx?
That it exists, that it is something that you can build small demonstrations with, and that it is, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time that there's been an opportunity to use something that was open source, free, visually accessible, and could kind of show you what the potential of digitizing rules actually looks like. So I'm very interested in spreading the word. Also, if you know anyone who works in investment compliance, I would be very interested in talking to them to see if there's something that I could learn.
And if you know anybody with $1.2 million,
hook me up.
Yep.
I would love to start a research and a research institute at the local university and just make Blawx better and keep releasing it as open source for the rest of my life if that was a financial possibility. So don't hesitate to give me your $1 million.
Yeah, and you notice, Jason, the way I said it was 1.2 million. I've already added an extra 200,000 on there.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure you're expecting a 20% cut. So
there could there's I will always say that I deserve a cut. That goes without saying. I'll always say that.
Yeah.
But it may not be the case. But I figured, if we're going to make the ask, let's add a little on to that.
Why not?
Right. Jason Velez, any last minute question for him?
No, I applaud what you're doing, Jason. And I would you hit it there at the end again. I cannot express enough in your journey that the ability to use that demonstratability to your end point is going to be incredibly valuable because that makes it tangible. A slide is just a slide. A slide that does blip, blip, blip in that particular person's area of interest is very powerful. And I think, leverage that as much as you can.
And the presentation that I did for the Regulatory Innovation Showcase in Ottawa, I have a video on YouTube that duplicates that and shows you, I actually build 2 different applications off the basis of a Blawx encoding that's built live in the video and runs live off the website. So if you're interested in seeing what it looks like, YouTube is out there.
Cool.
Excellent. So, and what would they search on YouTube for that? Is there Jason Morris?
Jason Morris rules as code.
Yeah, I believe
YouTube,
that's how.
And that would probably get you pretty close.
And I believe I also came across your YouTube. I came across your TEDx talk.
The TEDx talk is out there as well, yeah.
By typing in computational law, I think is how I initially did the search there.
Yeah, that's out there too.
So tell everybody, Jason Morris, how they can find you and how they can get in touch.
The easiest way to get in touch with me is Twitter. I'm at Roundtable Law on Twitter.
Okay.
Blawx also has a Twitter account at BlawxAI.
And Blawx is spelled?
BLAWX. Combination of law and building blocks. So, Twitter is the easy way to get a hold of me. If you want to shoot me a longer form thing, get a hold of me. I'm Jason at roundtablelaw.ca.
Okay.
I'm absolutely happy to talk with anyone who's interested.
And the website is blawx.com?
Yeah, www.blawx.com.
All right. Thank you so much.
There's a live demo you can play with.
There is a live demo that you can play with. And Jason Velez, how do folks get in touch with you?
Yeah, they want to. At legalpariah.com.
Hold on. What have we been talking about? What is the one company we've been talking about?
What?
One Law.
At onelaw.com. But no, just at One Law on Twitter, onelaw.com. It's just me. You'll see me floating around at a legal conference near you. That's what I like to do.
And One Law is the One Law website is the number one LAW.
Number one LAW. Yep. There.
And on Twitter, it's the number one LAW.
Yep. On Instagram. Yep. So no, it's cool. Nick, thank you, Jason. It's a good stuff, man. I'm just so excited for. This is like, I love big thinking. I just love it because that's why we're lawyers.
This is the fun stuff. I mean, this is the really exciting stuff. The stuff that keeps me doing the show, I really love seeing the changes in this space.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. So
hopefully
thank you both.
Spread the word and keep the momentum going.
Thank you both to Jason Morris and Jason Velez for being here tonight. Thank you to all those who have watched on Facebook and in the Zoom room. And Jason, the 2 Jasons, don't disappear after recording ends. I'll tell you some follow-up stuff. Okay. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for being here tonight. Thank you all. Daza, Carolyn, Adam, thank you for being here, and we'll talk to you all next week. We are off. We will be back the following week with Dan Rubens from Legal Robot. He's going to come and do a follow-up show. Dan is one of our first early on interviews, and that information was lost in platform changes, so Dan is coming back, and he's also been on the California access through innovation of law. But that is over now, so he can now be vocal about his experience on
excellent
on that. So anyway, come back and see us March 19th. And before that, we do have next Saturday on a special event, we'll have Richard Tromans from Artificial Lawyer in preparation for his California Legal Innovators Conference. So we're doing a special one on March 14th. So thank you all for being here, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Buenas noches.